When the letter arrived, Helen Ward thought it was another piece of junk mail. Bills, maybe a retirement newsletter, or some charity asking for another generous donation. She didn't expect to see her daughter's name printed in bold letters above a court seal. She sat at her kitchen table, the morning sun cutting across the room, and read every word slowly. Her daughter, Elise Ward Halpern, was filing a petition to have her declared legally incompetent. In plain English, that meant Elise wanted control of everything: Helen's estate, her accounts, and most importantly, the Charles Research Fund, a $1.4 million trust her late uncle had left her to manage. Helen read it twice, her hands steady, her coffee untouched. There it was, in black and white. Her only child, a successful corporate lawyer in Manhattan, wanted to strip her of her rights. She exhaled through her nose, like she used to when some rookie prosecutor showed up late to court. The document was professional, clean and cold. Elise had even attached a doctor's note claiming Helen showed signs of cognitive decline. The doctor's name meant nothing to her. She'd never seen him in her life. She turned the last page, saw the signature, Elise's, neat and perfect, the same looping E she'd practiced on birthday cards as a teenager, the same E that'd once been drawn in pink glitter on a homemade Mother's Day card. Helen stared at it, then set the papers down. "Interesting," she said quietly. "My own daughter thinks I'm too old to think." She stood up, poured herself more coffee, and took a long sip. Then she read the petition again, this time like a case file. The language was sharp, the evidence weak, and the tones smug. Elise thought she could outsmart her mother. The thought was almost funny. Almost. Helen had prosecuted fraud, perjury, and elder abuse for 30 years. She'd put people like Elise and her husband Ethan on the stand 100 times, but she never imagined she'd have to build a defense against her own blood. She reached for her reading glasses and began jotting notes in the margins, dates, claims, discrepancies. She wasn't angry yet. Anger clouded judgment. What she felt was colder than that. Methodical. Outside, the seagulls screamed. The sound made her think of the courtroom, a place where silence was more dangerous than shouting. She looked out the window toward the harbour, the water calm, the air sharp with salt. Helen opened her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and stopped at one name. Elise. Her thumb hovered over it. She didn't call. She didn't text. Not yet. Instead, she grabbed an old manila folder from the drawer labelled Personal Affairs. Inside were her will, her medical directives, and a letter she'd written years ago in case of future disputes. She smiled faintly. "Guess it's showtime," she murmured. At that moment, her phone buzzed. A message from Elise. "Mom, I sent over the paperwork. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. You'll be taken care of." Helen stared at the words, "taken care of." She almost laughed, the kind of laugh that never reaches your mouth. She typed a reply, then deleted it. She didn't trust herself to send what she wanted to say. She shut her phone off, took one more sip of cold coffee, and started a list, not of grievances, but of facts. She knew that when emotion ruled, justice died, and she wasn't about to let her daughter bury either of them. By noon, she had 2 pages filled with dates, names, and every inconsistency she'd found in the petition. She circled the doctor's name in red ink. Next to it, she wrote one word: fake. And then she looked at her old courtroom photo hanging on the wall, her younger self standing beside a judge, smiling after a conviction. Beneath it, a small brass plaque read, "Helen Ward, District Attorney, 1989 to 2011. Her reflection in the frame looked older, thinner, but her eyes were the same. Sharp, tired but sharp. When the clock struck 1, she folded the petition neatly, slipped it into her briefcase, and locked the door behind her. She hadn't driven to Manhattan in years, but the car still started, like it remembered her. The GPS asked where she wanted to go. She didn't hesitate. New York County Courthouse. The navigation voice responded cheerfully. Estimated arrival time, 2 hours and 21 minutes. Helen nodded. Let's see what my brilliant daughter has to say for herself. As the car pulled out of the driveway, she reached for the radio, but stopped halfway. She preferred silence. It helped her think. Halfway across the bridge, her phone buzzed again. This time from Ethan, her son-in-law. "Helen, it's Ethan. Let's all stay calm. Elise just wants what's best for you," she smirked. "What's best for me," she said aloud, "is never what Ethan wants." The rest of the drive was quiet, except for the hum of the tyres and the ticking of the turn signal. When she reached the city, traffic was brutal, but Helen was used to long waits before justice. She parked across from the courthouse, stepped out, and looked up at the massive stone columns. It felt strange being back on this side of the law, as the defendant instead of the prosecutor. But she didn't feel small. Not yet. She pulled out her phone again and snapped a photo of the courthouse steps. Then she opened her notes app and typed a single line. "They're not just suing me, they're underestimating me." A gust of cold wind swept through the street, scattering a few loose papers at her feet. She let them go. She'd be picking up much bigger messes soon enough. As she walked toward the courthouse doors, she said to herself, "I taught my daughter everything she knows about the law. Unfortunately for her, I didn't teach her everything I know." If you've ever watched a family turn into a courtroom battle, tell me in the comments what you think you'd do in Helen's place. And if you want to see how this fight unfolds, hit subscribe, because it's about to get interesting. Helen reached for the heavy courthouse door, and the echo of her own footsteps followed her inside. The elevator doors opened to a sound Helen knew too well: expensive laughter. She stepped out onto the 12th floor of her daughter's Brooklyn Heights brownstone. The air smelled of lavender diffusers and new money. Through the open archway, she saw Elise arranging wine glasses at the dining table, Ethan by the counter, swirling a decanter like he was auditioning for a commercial about refined taste. Helen hung her coat, adjusted her sweater, and walked in like she owned the place, because technically part of it had been bought with her money. "Mom," Elise said brightly, the same practiced tone she used in front of juries. "You made it." "I was invited," Helen replied, pulling out a chair. Ethan poured red wine and smiled. "Always good to see you, Judge Ward." "I retired a decade ago," she said flatly. "You can drop the title," he chuckled. "Old habits. So I heard you got the paperwork?" Helen looked at him over the rim of her glass. "I did. I read it 3 times just to make sure my dementia didn't kick in." Elise's smile twitched. "Mom, please, it's not personal. It's just procedural, for your protection." Helen raised an eyebrow. "And here I was thinking it was for your portfolio." Silence spread like ink across the table. The only sound came from the faint jazz music playing in the background, the kind people put on when they want to sound classy without having to think. Ethan cleared his throat. "Look, we're just trying to avoid chaos later. You know how these estates get. Lawyers, accountants." "Thieves," Helen cut in. "Yes, I know how they get." He grinned tightly. "That's not fair." "I didn't say it was. I said it was true." Elise stood up, pacing toward the kitchen. "Mom, you're making this difficult. I'm just asking you to trust me." "I did," Helen said, "right up until you hired a fake doctor to sign a report about my mind." Elise froze. Ethan's glass stopped midair. Helen smiled faintly. "You really should lock your printer. It still had the invoice inside." For a moment, the room held its breath. Then Ethan tried to recover. "You must be mistaken." Helen leaned back. "I've mistaken plenty of things in life, but I never mistake a bribe form signed in blue ink." Elise turned, her voice low. "You went through my office?" "No," Helen said. "I went through my daughter's soul. Unfortunately, it wasn't hard to find the cracks." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You have no proof?" "Not yet," she said, "but I've learned that the guilty always give it to you eventually, usually in a panic." Elise swallowed, her tone softening. "Mom, you're overreacting. Derek and I—" "Ethan," Helen corrected. "Don't get sloppy with aliases. You're still in a courtroom when you talk to me." He stood up now, offended but cautious. "Are you threatening us?" Helen smiled. "I'm just letting the record show I'm not as forgetful as your little plan suggests." The timer on the oven dinged. No one moved. Elise finally whispered, "You're not supposed to be like this." Helen tilted her head. "Like what?" "Cold. Strategic. You're supposed to be old, Ed? That's what you mean." Elise turned away, tears catching the edge of her voice. "You don't understand. We've been under pressure. Derek, Ethan lost a big contract. We just needed a safety net." Helen stood. "You wanted me to be the safety net, not the person, the wallet, the name." The name. The oven beeped again, sharp and repetitive, like a reminder that something was burning. Ethan broke the silence. "We should eat." Helen laughed softly. "Oh, let's. It's not every day I get to dine with my own plaintiffs." Dinner began. but no one tasted anything. Helen watched the two of them across the table. Elise picked at her salmon. Ethan checked his phone, pretending to be casual. Helen noticed the tremor in his hand when he lifted his glass. "Funny thing about justice," Helen said, cutting her food neatly. "It's not loud, it waits. Just long enough for the guilty to relax." Ethan looked up. "You talk like you're building a case." Helen didn't blink. "I always am." He laughed nervously. "You really think you can fight this? Elise has the best legal team in Manhattan." Helen dabbed her mouth with a napkin. "I trained half of them." The colour drained from Elise's face. She knew it was true. Helen stood, grabbed her coat, and headed toward the door. "Thank you for dinner. It reminded me why I prefer eating alone." Elise followed. "Mom, please, don't make this ugly." Helen turned, eyes calm but sharp. "Sweetheart, it already is." Ethan stepped forward. "If you take this to court, we'll win. You know that, right?" Helen gave him a thin smile. "Then I guess I'll see you at the winner's table." She opened the door, and the night air hit her face like cold water. As she walked out, she heard the muffled sound of her daughter's voice behind her, something between fear and defiance. By the time Helen reached her car, she wasn't angry anymore. She was focused. Her hands didn't shake when she put the key in the ignition. She'd seen too many betrayals dressed up as concern. This one just happened to share her last name. On the drive home, the skyline glittered in the rearview mirror. She caught her reflection in the glass, steady, unsentimental, and alive. Somewhere between Brooklyn and the Hudson, she turned off the radio and spoke softly to herself. "If they want a case, I'll give them one worth remembering." The GPS rerouted because of traffic, but Helen didn't mind. She had time. And this time, silence would be her strategy. The road back to Port Harlow was quiet except for the hum of tyres and the faint ticking of the old dashboard clock. Helen kept both hands on the wheel. The car smelled faintly of salt and leather, familiar, grounding. When she reached her small house by the river, the porch light flickered on automatically. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the framed photos lining the hallway, her late husband Richard, their first Christmas, and a little Elise with her front teeth missing. The kind of memories that used to mean safety. Now they were just exhibits in a case she didn't ask for. She hung her coat, kicked off her shoes, and sat down at the kitchen table. The same spot where 30 years ago she'd drafted her closing argument for a high-profile fraud case. It felt strange to be back at that same table, preparing to defend her own sanity. She opened her laptop and pressed record. The small red dot blinked on the screen. "Personal log," she said calmly. "March 14th, 9:32 p.m. I've reviewed my daughter's legal petition. I find the claims unsupported and the intent malicious. This file is for documentation, not emotion." Her voice sounded steady. She stopped the recording and saved it to an encrypted drive. Then she opened her notebook and wrote, "Silence today will protect justice tomorrow." It wasn't just a phrase, it was a plan. Helen knew that reacting emotionally would play into their hands. If Elise and Ethan wanted to paint her as unstable, the best thing she could do was become the calmest woman on the eastern seaboard. She made a list, practical, surgical. 1. Verify the medical report. 2. Identify the source of the payment to the doctor. 3. Gather witnesses of daily routine and cognitive activity. 4. Wait for them to make their next move. Her training kicked in. The law was a game of patience and precision, and she was a veteran. She knew that the more her opponents talked, the more evidence they left behind. The next morning, the river mist hung thick over the deck. Helen made coffee, poured it into a chipped mug, and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. Margot Lane, a warm, gravelly voice, answered. Helen smiled faintly. "Still alive, I see." "Barely," Margot said. "What's wrong, Helen? You sound like someone who's just read a subpoena." "I did," Helen replied, "from my daughter." The line went silent for a few seconds. Then Margot said quietly, "All right, tell me everything." By the time Helen finished explaining, Margot's tone had changed. "You still have the recording from that night?" "Yes." "And you're sure about the medical examiner?" "I traced the license. It expired 5 years ago. Whoever signed it either forged the renewal or got paid to look the other way." Margot exhaled. "That's criminal, not just unethical. You want me to dig?" Helen hesitated. "Not yet. I want them to think I'm cornered. People show their true nature when they believe they've already won." Margot laughed under her breath. Still the strategist. You realize you sound like you're building a sting operation. I'm building peace of mind, Helen said. Justice will be the side effect. After they hung up, Helen turned her focus to evidence. She called Dr. Richard Lowell, a neurologist she'd worked with on several competency hearings. He agreed to meet that Friday for an independent evaluation. No lawyers, no publicity, just a report from a man she trusted. She spent the afternoon organising documents, bank statements, old case notes, property records. She wasn't hoarding, she was building a wall of truth, one piece of paper at a time. At sunset, she stepped outside. The wind carried the briny scent of the river. From across the water, the Port Harlow lighthouse flickered on, a thin beam slicing through fog. She'd always found comfort in that light, how it blinked every 8 seconds, steady and predictable. Unlike people. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Mom, you're being unreasonable. Ethan and I just want to help. Don't make this worse. Helen read it twice, then typed back, You already did. She deleted the draft before sending it. Silence was still her best weapon. Inside, the living room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She glanced at the old mantel clock, 9:47 p.m, the same hour she used to call it a night when she was still working, but now her mind felt sharper than it had in years. She opened the recorder again. The red dot blinked to life. Entry 2, she said softly. Elise and Ethan have doubled down. They've mistaken my silence for surrender. Good. The quieter I stay, the louder the truth will sound later. She stopped the recording and leaned back, staring at the dark screen. For a second, she saw her reflection. Older, yes, but not broken. The phone rang once more. This time it was Margot. Quick update, she said. That fake examiner? He has a cousin at Ethan's company. Found their names linked in a past construction bid. Guess who signed the notarization? Helen closed her eyes, suppressing a bitter laugh. You know, I used to think I'd seen every kind of fraud imaginable. And now? Now I realise I raised one. Margot didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Helen looked out the window again. The lighthouse blinked, once, twice. Her pulse matched its rhythm. Keep everything quiet, Helen said. If they want a show, they'll get it when the curtain's ready. Margot sighed. You're really doing this alone? I'm never alone, Helen replied. I have the truth. It's not much company, but it never lies. She hung up, turned off the lamp and walked toward her bedroom. On the nightstand sat an old photo, Elise at 10, missing teeth, holding a science fair ribbon. Helen touched the frame lightly, then turned it face down. The red light on her recorder blinked once more in the darkness before it shut itself off, leaving the room in perfect, deliberate silence. The morning rain had just stopped when Helen parked outside a narrow brick building on Main Street. The sign above the door read Lane and Associates, Private Investigation. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Margot Lane was already there, sitting behind her desk, glasses perched halfway down her nose, scanning a stack of reports. Helen didn't knock. She never did. You still keep this place colder than a morgue, she said, hanging her coat on the chair. Margot looked up. Keeps the brain sharp. What's your excuse? Helen sat down, her face unreadable. You said you found something. I did, Margot replied, sliding a folder across the desk. This is about your son-in-law, Ethan Halpern. Turns out his company, Halpern Equity Group, was investigated in 2018 for misappropriation of client funds. Case dropped because the key witness vanished. Helen flipped through the pages, her eyes moving faster than her expression. Disappeared? Vanished off payroll, out of the country, new identity, probably bought and silenced. Helen nodded once. That fits the pattern. Margot leaned back. There's more. The doctor who signed your cognitive report? His licence was suspended for falsifying insurance claims. I spoke to an old contact at the State Board. He's been working under the radar since 2020, using new credentials under a different clinic name. Helen's lips tightened, but she didn't react. So Elise and Ethan didn't just cross a line. They built a bridge over it. Margot smirked. You always had a way with words. I had a way with facts, Helen corrected. Words just made them hurt more. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the wet street gleamed like glass under the morning sun. Helen closed the folder, her fingers resting on the edge. Margot, I want you to dig up every bank record linked to Ethan's firm and cross-check any transfers tied to this doctor. I'll handle the legal end. Margot studied her. Helen, you're walking into a hornet's nest. These people have money, lawyers, and a lot to lose. I have something better, Helen said. Time. Margot sighed. And what happens if Elise realizes you're investigating? She won't, Helen said simply. She still thinks I'm reading crossword puzzles and forgetting where I left my keys. They shared a short laugh, the kind that ends too soon. Margot's tone softened. You know, Helen, I've seen people break over far less betrayal than this. Helen gave a dry smile. You'd be surprised how steady you get once you stop expecting decency from blood. She stood, straightened her coat, and grabbed the folder. I'll be in touch. As she stepped outside, the breeze carried the scent of damp concrete and car exhaust. She took a deep breath. The city felt different now. Less like home, more like evidence. Her next stop was the old courthouse. The security guard, a heavy-set man with kind eyes, recognized her instantly. Miss Ward? Haven't seen you since the mayor's ethics scandal. Helen smiled faintly. That's because I retired before politics got worse. He laughed, waving her through. Good luck, ma'am. Still keeping them honest? Trying, she said, stepping into the elevator. Upstairs she found the archives room, rows of old case files stretching into the distance. The scent of paper and dust brought back memories, late nights, cold coffee, moral wars that never really ended. She stopped at the Ward Helen section, where her own history waited in faded boxes. She opened one labelled Ethics Committee Hearings, 1999 to 2005. Inside, she found a transcript with a name she hadn't seen in years. Stephen Carver, Clerk, Probationary Hearing, 1999. Helen ran her thumb over the paper. Carver had been a scared young intern back then, caught accepting a bribe from a defence attorney. She'd saved his career, convincing the panel to give him a second chance. Now rumour had it he was a judge in New York County, possibly the one presiding over her own case. Full circle, she murmured. She copied the transcript and slipped it into her folder. By afternoon, she was back home. The river shimmered silver under the clouded sky. On the kitchen counter sat her old typewriter, a relic she never threw away. She fed in a sheet of paper and began typing. To whom it may concern, I, Helen Ward, am of sound mind and full mental capacity. Any claims suggesting otherwise are fraudulent and motivated by financial interest. I hereby request that all future medical assessments be conducted by state-certified professionals with results witnessed and notarized. This letter is my official statement of self-determination. She signed her name at the bottom, bold and clear. Then she slid it into an envelope and stamped it with the seal she'd once used as district attorney. Old habits died harder than reputations. That evening, Margot called again. Quick update. I traced a payment from Ethan's company, $75,000 cash withdrawal, 3 days before the petition was filed. Guess where it went? Let me guess, Helen said. Into the doctor's pocket? Close. Into his nephew's account, then to a shell company registered under a false address in Newark. Classic laundering. Helen took a sip of coffee. Send me copies of everything. I'll make it part of the record. You really think this will hold up? Margot asked. It doesn't have to, Helen said. It just has to exist. Truth has a way of surviving longer than arrogance. She hung up, walked to the window, and watched the river darken under the setting sun. The reflection of the lighthouse blinked across the water like an unspoken signal. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, steady and deliberate. In her mind, she could already see the courtroom, the polished wood, the heavy silence, the look on Elise's face when the truth started to surface. But she pushed the thought away. Revenge wasn't the goal. Order was. She turned off the lights, walked down the hall, and paused by the front door. Her old courtroom briefcase leaned against the wall, worn but intact. She picked it up and set it on the kitchen table, flipping it open to find a single pen resting inside. It was engraved with 3 words, "For justice always." Helen clicked it once, the sound sharp in the quiet house. Then she wrote a final note in her journal for the night. The past never sleeps. It only waits for its moment to testify. The pen rolled to a stop beside her cup, and the steady hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, calm and absolute. The next morning, the fog over Port Harlow was so thick that the lighthouse beam looked like it was swimming through milk. Helen sat at her dining table, coffee in one hand. a thick folder in the other. Every page inside was a piece of the life her daughter thought she could erase. Across the table, Margot leaned over her laptop. So you've got the medical report, the bank records, and the affidavit draft ready. What's the strategy? Helen didn't answer right away. She was reading the top line of the forged doctor's note again, her thumb tapping once against the edge. We don't chase them, she said. We let them build confidence. The louder they get, the easier it'll be to hear their mistakes. Margot smirked. Classic Helen Ward, the silent strike. I'm too old to shout, Helen said dryly. Silence is cheaper and more effective. She flipped to a handwritten page, her own notes from the night of the dinner. They'll expect me to panic, maybe even call Elise to plead. That's how most parents lose leverage. They mistake guilt for strategy. Margot closed the laptop and leaned back. And when do you want to go public? Not yet, Helen said. We're not making headlines, we're making a record. She stood, walked over to her file cabinet and opened the bottom drawer. Inside were a dozen sealed envelopes, each labelled with a name. Old colleagues, she said, sliding them out. People who still remember how I used to write. She placed them in a neat stack. I'll send one to each judge, attorney and investigator I've worked with, requesting written attestations of my competence and memory. I don't need sympathy, I need signatures. Margot nodded. It's smart. Establishing a paper trail before the hearing. If Elise wants a declaration of incompetence, she'll have to argue against 12 sitting judges and a psychiatrist. Helen allowed herself the smallest smile. I didn't raise a fool. I raised someone who thinks she's smarter than everyone else. That's a much easier opponent. They spent the next 2 hours reviewing dates and matching them to possible witnesses. Helen spoke with the precision of someone conducting an orchestra. Calm, deliberate, unforgiving. At noon, Margot's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. It's Elise. Helen looked up. Don't answer. I won't, Margot said, grinning. Just thought you'd enjoy knowing she's sweating. Helen chuckled softly. Good, let her feel it. Silence is the most expensive currency there is. When Margot left, Helen walked to her study. She took out her old typewriter, fed in a clean sheet of paper, and began typing the heading. Plan of silence, phase 1. Underneath, she wrote, Objective, prove mental competence without direct confrontation. Method, strategic documentation, controlled communication, legal precision. Outcome, restoration of truth without emotional contamination. She typed slowly, her fingers steady. Each word sounded like a verdict. She paused to pour herself another cup of coffee, then returned to the typewriter and began the second section. Phase 2, Witness Network. Reach out to 12 colleagues, including Judge Miriam O'Neill and Dr. Richard Lowell. Request signed statements verifying memory, reasoning, and agency. Maintain confidentiality. She stopped typing long enough to glance at a framed photograph of her husband, Richard. He was smiling, holding a fishing rod, the sun behind him. You always said patience wins more cases than proof, she whispered. You'd enjoy this one. By the time she finished the document, it was 3 pages long. She dated it, folded it, and placed it inside a plain brown envelope labelled Personal Legal Strategy. She sealed it with wax, an old-fashioned touch, but she liked the sound it made when it hardened. That afternoon, she drove to town and stopped by the post office. The clerk, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, greeted her. Morning, Miss Ward. Haven't seen you in a while. I've been busy, she said, sliding the stack of envelopes onto the counter. He looked at the labels. A lot of official folks you're mailing to. Some sort of reunion? You could say that, Helen replied with a smile. When she got back home, the light outside had dimmed to a soft gold. The tide had risen, lapping against the rocks behind her house. She placed her briefcase on the table, opened it, and set the original court summons inside. For a long moment, she stared at the embossed seal on the top of the document. Petition for guardianship, filed by Elise Ward Halpin. Then she tore a blank sheet from her notebook and wrote in neat cursive, This is not a guardianship hearing. It's a character trial, and only one of us has a record of winning those. She slid the note inside the folder and closed it. The phone rang once. Caller ID private number. She let it go to voicemail. The automated voice played seconds later. Mom, I don't know what you're doing, but this isn't healthy. Ethan and I just want to protect you. Please don't make this harder than it already is. Helen listened, then pressed delete. Her silence wasn't cruelty, it was preparation. In her career, she'd learned that reacting too soon always handed control to the wrong person. The strongest moment in any courtroom wasn't when someone shouted objection. It was when the entire room went quiet and everyone turned toward the person who didn't flinch. That was her weapon now. The pause. The stillness. She sat back down and reviewed the growing pile of evidence, the forged medical report, the proof of bribery, the letters of support she'd already received from her peers. She arranged everything neatly in the folder, one section at a time. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the glass panes. She watched as the lighthouse beam swept across the water, its reflection breaking and reforming with every wave. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Margot. Everything set, phase 1 complete, ready when you are. Helen replied with 2 words, begin silence. Then she set her phone face down on the table, turned off the lights, and sat in the dim glow from the window. The sound of the tide was steady, measured, the same rhythm she'd used to time her closing arguments for decades. She closed her eyes and took a breath, the kind that steadies you before a verdict, before a storm, before everything finally makes sense. The morning the hearing notice arrived, Helen was already awake. She'd been reading case law since 5 a.m., just as she used to when the courtroom was still her battlefield. The official letter sat on the counter, stamped with the New York County Court's seal. The date was set, 3 weeks from Friday. She didn't flinch. She just poured another cup of coffee and read the fine print twice. The petitioner's attorney was a young associate from a mid-level firm Elise's husband must have hired. Helen almost pitied him. Almost. At 10, Margot stopped by with a folder and 2 croissants. You look calm, she said, sitting down. Should I be worried? Helen smiled faintly. Worry when I start baking cookies for reconciliation. Margot slid the folder across the table. Here's the final affidavit package. 12 letters of endorsement, notarized. Dr. Lowell's competency report came back clean. Full cognitive function, no impairment, no delusion. Helen nodded. Perfect. File copies for the record and keep one sealed. Margot studied her for a moment. You really don't want to tell Elise you know about the fraud? Helen stirred her coffee slowly. Why warn a thief before the audit? They spent the next hour reviewing logistics. What Helen would wear, who'd accompany her, how to avoid the press. By noon, everything was in place. The plan of silence was complete. All she had to do was show up and let truth do the talking. That night, she wrote in her journal, a courtroom is never just about law. It's theatre, timing, and moral stamina. Let them underestimate the actress who wrote the script. The following week passed with the strange calm that always precedes a storm. Elise tried calling twice. Helen didn't answer. Ethan sent a long email filled with corporate-sounding empathy. We just want to ensure your comfort during this process. Helen deleted it without opening the attachments. Comfort was for people who'd done nothing worth being uncomfortable about. When Friday finally came, the air was sharp, the kind that bites the skin. Helen wore a moss-green coat and sensible boots, the kind that said she wasn't there for pity. Margot picked her up right at 7. You sure about no lawyer? Margot asked as they pulled into the city. I don't need someone to speak for me, Helen said. I just need someone to hold the door open. Traffic thickened as they neared Manhattan. From the passenger window, Helen saw the skyline, the grey towers, the sharp edges of a city she'd once ruled in silence. The courthouse loomed ahead, white marble washed by the morning light. Inside, people hurried past, clutching case files, coffee, anxiety. Helen walked through the metal detector, her pace unhurried. When the clerk asked for her name, she said it clearly. Helen Ward, respondent. The young woman blinked, typing quickly. Former prosecutor, right? Helen smiled. Former everything, apparently. They were early. Courtroom 3B was small but bright, sunlight spilling across the oak floors. Helen chose the back row, her hands resting neatly in her lap. She'd spent half her life watching people in these rooms, nervous, desperate, guilty, brave. Today, she was none of those things. At precisely 9:30, the door opened. Elise walked in, perfectly dressed, posture confident. Behind her, Ethan followed, expression rehearsed. Half concern, half control. They didn't see Helen at first. They were too busy whispering to their lawyer, a tall man with slicked hair and an overconfident grin. When Elise finally spotted her mother, she froze for half a second. Just enough. Helen met her gaze and smiled politely, the same expression she'd once given defendants right before presenting evidence. Margot leaned close and whispered, "I think she just remembered who raised her." Helen didn't reply. The clerk began setting up microphones. Papers shuffled, laptops clicked. The judge's seat was still empty. Then at 9:40 the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." Everyone stood as Judge Stephen Carver entered. Helen's eyes didn't flicker, but she felt something shift. She recognized him instantly. The young intern she'd once saved from disbarment now wore the black robe with confidence. He glanced at the file, adjusting his glasses, his face unreadable. "Case number 24-9185, the clerk announced. "Petitioner, Elise Ward Halpern. Respondent, Helen Ward." Carver started reading, his voice even. "Petition to declare respondent mentally incapacitated and to appoint petitioner as guardian of estate per New York State statute." He stopped mid-sentence, his brow furrowed. Then he looked up, really looked. For a second, the air changed, his gaze locked on Helen. Recognition struck like a quiet thunderclap. "Miss Ward," he said, his tone soft but formal. "Would that be Helen Ward, former district attorney for this court?" A murmur rippled through the room. Elise's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Helen inclined her head. "Yes, Your Honour." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was absolute. Carver's voice broke it softly. "Then this court acknowledges your years of service to the state of New York." He paused, then straightened his papers. "Proceed." Elise's lawyer cleared his throat, clearly thrown off. "Your Honour, while we respect Miss Ward's prior service, the issue at hand concerns her current mental state. Carver raised a hand. "I'm aware of the issue, Counselor. Continue." Helen sat perfectly still. She didn't need to speak. The balance had already shifted. As Elise's attorney read through the petition, his tone wavered slightly. Every accusation sounded smaller against the backdrop of who Helen was. Ethan kept his eyes down, pretending to study a file. Elise, though, couldn't hide the tightening of her jaw. Margot leaned closer and whispered, "Your silence just made history." Helen didn't respond. She only adjusted her glasses and watched as her daughter's plan unravelled, quietly, methodically, and without mercy. The judge continued listening, his expression unreadable. The gavel rested on the bench, motionless. Sunlight moved across the floor, landing squarely on Helen's briefcase. The same one that had followed her through 3 decades of justice. And for the first time since this began, Helen felt the stillness of power return exactly where it belonged. Helen could hear the steady hum of fluorescent lights above her as the clerk swore in witnesses. Courtroom 3B had the same smell she remembered from her working days, fresh polish, warm wood, and nerves. Elise sat at the plaintiff's table, a perfect portrait of poise, flipping through her notes like she was about to win an award. Ethan sat beside her, smug, tapping a pen against his legal pad as if the rhythm made him smarter. The young lawyer at their table, trying too hard to look confident, turned toward Elise and whispered something. She nodded, smiled faintly, and then glanced across the room at Helen. That smile held no warmth. It was the grin of someone who believed the verdict had already been written. Helen kept her eyes on the judge's bench. Judge Carver shuffled through documents, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, his gaze settled on Elise. "You may proceed, Counselor." The young attorney stood. "Your Honour, this case concerns the declining mental competence of Mrs. Helen Ward. We have evidence of erratic behaviour, memory loss, and recent confusion regarding her financial management. Our only goal is to ensure her well-being." Helen had heard this speech 100 times before, from younger, hungrier versions of him, always claiming concern when money was the real motive. She didn't move, didn't blink. The lawyer continued, "My client, Mrs. Ward Halpern, has provided medical documentation from a licensed physician and personal accounts of cognitive decline." Judge Carver interrupted without looking up. "We'll address the validity of that documentation later." A quiet ripple of tension passed through the room. Elise crossed her legs, still confident. Ethan leaned back, smirking. Then the lawyer gestured toward Helen. "With your permission, Your Honour, I'd like to call Mrs. Ward for questioning." Carver nodded. "Proceed." Helen rose calmly and walked to the stand. The young clerk held out a Bible. Helen placed her hand on it, voice clear. "I do." The attorney stepped closer, too close. "Mrs. Ward, can you tell the court your current address?" Helen looked him dead in the eye. Yes, but you already have it on file. Do you want it for accuracy or theatrics? A few chuckles rippled through the gallery. The lawyer's face reddened. Please answer the question. 42 River Lane, Port Harlow, she said smoothly. And how long have you lived there? 8 years, 5 months, and 16 days. Longer than most lawyers last in one firm. The laughter this time was louder. Even Judge Carver smiled faintly before clearing his throat. Let's keep order in the court. The lawyer pressed on, his voice tightening. Mrs. Ward, do you manage your own finances? Yes. Without assistance? Unless you count the IRS. Elise's jaw flexed. The lawyer glanced at her, then back at Helen. Are you aware that your daughter has had to intervene on multiple occasions due to unpaid bills? Helen raised an eyebrow. Intervene or intercept? The lawyer blinked. Excuse me? Helen leaned slightly forward. If you're referring to the time she redirected my property tax notice to her office. Yes, I'm aware. I found it in her inbox. Carver shifted in his chair, now clearly paying attention. The attorney hesitated, then switched tactics. Mrs. Ward, do you recall visiting a Dr. Joseph Klein in January for an evaluation? I recall receiving a report signed by that name, Helen said evenly. I've never met him. The lawyer froze. You're saying the examination never occurred? I'm saying it's hard to have an exam with a man whose medical license expired in 2018. Gasps broke from the spectators. Elise's face went pale. Ethan's hand gripped the table. The young lawyer tried to recover, stammering, Your Honour, we can provide verification. Carver held up his hand. You'll have that opportunity. Continue. Helen folded her hands in her lap. Take your time, counsellor. We have all morning. The lawyer's confidence evaporated. He muttered something about reviewing documents and sat down. Carver turned his attention to Elise. Mrs. Ward Halpern, would you like to make a statement? Elise stood, smoothing her blazer. Yes, Your Honour. I love my mother. I'm not doing this to hurt her. I just want to have the care she deserves. Helen could hear the tremor behind the polish. Elise looked at her with practised sincerity, voice breaking at all the right moments. She's been forgetful, withdrawn. I'm scared for her. Helen tilted her head slightly. Scared enough to fake my medical history? Elise froze. That's not what happened. Carver watched quietly. The silence stretched. Helen didn't push. She knew the most dangerous thing in court wasn't accusation. It was time. The longer someone sat in their own lie, the heavier it became. Finally, Elise dropped her eyes. You're twisting everything, Mom. You always do. Helen smiled faintly. If you think that, dear, you haven't been paying attention these last 40 years. The young lawyer jumped in. Your Honour, I'd like to call a recess. Denied, Carver said firmly. We're not interrupting testimony when clarity is this close. Ethan muttered under his breath, but Carver's glare shut him up instantly. Helen sat back, calm as marble. She didn't gloat. The truth didn't need decoration. Carver adjusted his glasses. Before we proceed, I'd like to remind everyone in this courtroom that the respondent, Mrs. Ward, spent 3 decades serving this court with distinction. Whatever the outcome, she will be treated with the respect due her position. The room went silent again. Even the reporter from the Hudson Daily stopped typing. Helen glanced at Elise, her daughter's face stiff, her confidence cracking around the edges. Helen's voice was quiet but steady. Your Honour, may I say something for the record? Carver nodded. I taught my daughter everything she knows about the law, Helen said. Unfortunately, I couldn't teach her what it means. For a moment, even the lights seemed to hum louder. No one dared to move. Elise's eyes glistened, anger and shame tangled behind them. The courtroom, once her stage, had turned into her mirror. And Helen, the woman she'd tried to break, sat tall in the witness chair, silent, precise, and completely in control. The courtroom air had shifted. The laughter that once floated from the plaintiff's table was gone, replaced by the faint rustle of nervous paper. Elise stared down at her notes, eyes flicking to the door every few seconds as if waiting for someone to save her. Helen didn't move. Her hands were folded, her breathing calm, her gaze steady on Judge Carver. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was deliberate, built like a wall no one else in the room could climb. Carver leaned forward. Counsel, do you have any further evidence to support your client's claim? The young lawyer hesitated, fumbling with his folder. Yes, Your Honour, we have testimony from Dr. Joseph Klein regarding Carver raised a hand. The same doctor whose license expired 7 years ago? A beat of silence. The lawyer's mouth opened, closed, then stayed shut. Then I'll assume that line of evidence is withdrawn, Carver said. From the back row, a quiet voice cut through the tension. Your Honour, permission to present new evidence on behalf of the respondent. Every head turned. Margot Lane stepped forward, grey coat buttoned, posture unshakable. She carried a small black folder in one hand and a flash drive in the other. Carver nodded. State your name and relation to the respondent. Margot Lane, she said, former investigator, New York County District Attorney's Office, professional associate and personal friend of Mrs. Ward for over 20 years. Carver gestured for her to proceed. You may approach. Margot plugged the drive into the courtroom monitor. A file appeared on screen. Time-stamped audio. Your Honour, she said, her tone measured but sharp, this is a legally obtained recording under New York's one-party consent statute. It captures a private conversation between Mrs. Ward Halpin and her husband, Mr. Ethan Halpin, the night before this petition was filed. Elise's chair scraped against the floor. That's illegal! You can't! Carver's voice cut through hers. You'll remain seated, Mrs. Ward Halpin. Margot clicked play. Static, then voices. Ethan's first, calm, confident, dripping with entitlement. If she doesn't sign, we'll use the medical report. 2 weeks, and the assets are in your name. Elise's voice followed, quieter but clear. Are you sure it'll hold up in court? Of course, Ethan said. No one's going to question a retired judge's mental state. She's 71. The court will believe anything if it's wrapped in concern. There was a pause, then Elise again, her voice cracking slightly. And if she fights back? Then we make her look delusional, Ethan replied. You'll cry in court. Works every time. The audio stopped. No one spoke, not even the reporter typing in the corner. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights. Carver exhaled slowly. That file has been verified, Margot nodded. Metadata, chain of custody, timestamps, all intact. The original copy is stored with the district attorney's office. Carver looked at Helen. Mrs. Ward, did you authorise this submission? Helen's voice was calm. I did, Your Honour. I recorded it for my own safety, not vengeance. I only wanted the truth preserved. Carver leaned back, rubbing his temple. You've certainly preserved it. Elise's face had gone pale. She turned toward Ethan, whispering harshly, You said no one could trace it. Ethan didn't answer. His hand trembled slightly against the table. Carver looked at them both, his voice heavy. Mrs. Ward Halpin, Mr. Halpin, this court takes evidence tampering and coercion seriously. I advise you to remain silent for the moment. Helen didn't look at them. She didn't need to. The tremor in Elise's voice, the sweat on Ethan's collar, they were all the confession she'd ever need. Margot handed over the folder. Additionally, Your Honour, this includes a notarized record of a $75,000 cash withdrawal from Halpin Equity Group 3 days before the petition was filed. The funds were deposited into an account belonging to the same Dr. Klein, named in the fraudulent report. Carver skimmed the papers, his eyes narrowing with every line. All verified? Yes, sir. He nodded, tapping the gavel once, not as a verdict, but as punctuation. Let the record reflect that the petitioner's credibility is under serious question. Elise's lawyer tried to object, but the sound of his voice died under Carver's glare. The judge looked at Helen again, his expression softening for the first time that morning. Mrs. Ward, I remember standing before you once. I was 24, terrified, and one mistake away from losing my license. You told me, justice is only blind until you teach it to see again. I never forgot that. Helen nodded slightly. I remember. You were a good student. A faint smile crossed Carver's face before he turned back to the courtroom. This session will continue, but let it be noted. The court recognises substantial evidence suggesting misconduct by the petitioners. Helen's fingers brushed the edge of her briefcase. Her breathing was slow, steady. For the first time in months, she felt the room turn in her favour, not through aggression or outrage, but through precision. The truth had walked in quietly, wearing no armour, just proof. Margot stepped back beside her, whispering, That was the cleanest strike I've ever seen. Helen didn't smile. She just said, That's because it wasn't a strike. It was a mirror. Across the aisle, Elise's mascara had started to smudge. Ethan leaned close, whispering furiously, but Helen didn't need to hear the words. She'd seen that look on 100 defendants. The dawning realization that the story they built for control had just turned into evidence against them. Carver set the folder down and looked at the clerk. "We'll take a brief recess before reviewing this new material. Court will resume in 10 minutes. The gavel came down, a single sharp sound that didn't echo. It just landed, heavy and final, like the first drop of rain before a long cleansing storm. Helen rose from her seat. Her joints ached, her breath caught slightly, but her posture was perfect. As she gathered her papers, she heard Margot murmur, "You all right?" Helen nodded. "Better than they are." And with that, she turned toward the courthouse window. Outside, the city light was blinding, almost too bright to look at directly. It spilled across the courtroom floor, glinting off her briefcase, off the gavel, off every polished surface that now reflected what the truth had finally uncovered. When the recess ended, the courtroom felt colder. The reporters had stopped pretending to type quietly. They were ready to catch every word that came next. Elise's lawyer returned, looking pale and a little smaller. Ethan sat rigid, his fingers locked, his jaw clenched so tight it could crack. Helen didn't look at either of them. She had nothing left to say, and that was the point. Judge Carver adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Before we proceed, I've reviewed the submitted recordings, verified the financial documents, and confirmed the credentials of the investigator, Ms. Lane." He tapped his pen twice on the desk, a habit Helen remembered from years ago. "The evidence is admissible and, frankly, compelling." The young attorney began to rise, but Carver didn't even glance his way. "Sit down, counsellor. I've heard enough cross-examinations to recognise when the truth's already been said." The tension snapped like a wire. Elise's breathing grew uneven. Ethan whispered something sharp under his breath, but she didn't respond. Her hands trembled in her lap, knuckles white against the table. Carver turned his gaze to Helen. "Mrs. Ward, do you wish to make a statement before I render judgment?" Helen stood. Her movements were slow but deliberate, the kind that made every sound in the room seem louder. The click of her shoes on the polished floor echoed against the walls. She faced the judge, not her daughter. "Your Honour," she began, voice steady. "I came here today not to defend my sanity, but my integrity. The court can test my memory, my reasoning, my capacity, all of it. But what no test can measure is intent, and the intent behind this petition was never protection." She paused. No one moved. "It was profit," she said quietly, "a betrayal wrapped in concern. My daughter used the law not as a shield but as a weapon. I know because I taught her how sharp it can be." Elise looked up, tears welling but held back by pride. Ethan shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. Helen's tone softened, but it carried across the room like a gavel strike. "I don't hate her for it. Hatred wastes too much energy, but I do pity what greed can do to love. The law can restore justice, Your Honour, but it can't restore trust." Carver sat still, hands folded. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the courthouse lights. Then he nodded once. "Thank you, Mrs. Ward. Please be seated." Helen returned to her chair, her expression unreadable. Carver leaned forward, his voice low but clear. "This court has seen many forms of deception, but few so personal. The evidence presented shows a deliberate attempt by the petitioners to defraud and manipulate Mrs. Ward for financial gain. Therefore, the petition for guardianship is denied." A gasp rippled through the courtroom, then silence. Carver continued, his tone heavier. "Furthermore, this court recommends that the District Attorney's Office review this case for potential charges of fraud, conspiracy and perjury. Proceedings will be referred to the appropriate department." Elise's face went blank, not shocked, not angry, just empty. Ethan muttered, "This is ridiculous," but the bailiff's stare shut him up fast. Helen didn't flinch. She just folded her hands again, her nails pressed neatly into her palms. Carver set the papers aside and removed his glasses. "Before I close, I want to say something not as a judge, but as someone who once learned from you, Mrs. Ward." Helen looked up quietly. "You once told me," Carver said, "that silence is not weakness. It's a pause between injustice and truth. I didn't understand that then, but I do now." He reached for the gavel. Court is adjourned. The sharp crack echoed through the room, clean and final. Helen didn't stand right away. People began filing out, reporters whispering, clerks stacking papers, lawyers pretending not to stare. Elise sat motionless, staring at the table. Ethan tugged at her arm, but she pulled away. Helen rose, collected her folder, and turned to leave. As she walked past her daughter, Elise's voice came out small, fragile. "Mom, I never meant for it to go this far." Helen stopped, but didn't look at her. Every crime starts that way. She walked toward the aisle, her footsteps slow, her breathing steady. Margot joined her at the door. "You did it," she whispered. Helen shook her head. No, the truth did. Outside, the light was blinding. The sky was wide and sharp blue, the kind of colour that only appears after a storm. Margot followed her down the courthouse steps, glancing back at the swarm of reporters gathering near the entrance. "Want to give them a statement?" Margot asked. Helen smiled faintly. They wouldn't understand it. "What would you say if they did?" Helen paused halfway down the stairs. "That justice doesn't shout. It whispers. And today everyone finally heard it." Margot chuckled softly. "That's going on a plaque somewhere." They reached the sidewalk. Cars passed, horns honking, people living their lives, oblivious to the quiet war that had just ended inside those marble walls. Helen took a slow breath, her chest expanding against the weight she'd carried for months. It didn't feel like victory, it felt like exhale. A gust of wind picked up, scattering a few loose papers from someone's briefcase. One fluttered near Helen's feet, a blank legal form, crisp and unused. She picked it up, folded it carefully, and handed it to the man chasing it. "Don't waste good paper," she said with a half-smile. He thanked her, confused, and hurried off. Helen turned toward the street, her voice quiet. "Let's go home." Margot opened the car door for her. "You think Elise will face charges?" Helen looked out the window as they drove away, the courthouse shrinking behind them. "Maybe. But that's not my case anymore." The reflection of the city flashed across her face, the skyline, the grey river, the sunlight hitting glass. She reached into her coat pocket and took out her old brass pen, the one engraved, "For Justice Always." She turned it between her fingers, feeling its familiar weight. Margot glanced over. "You keeping that as a souvenir?" Helen smiled faintly. "No, as a reminder, justice isn't about winning. It's about knowing when not to speak." The traffic light ahead turned green. The car moved forward, quiet, steady and sure. By the time Helen and Margot reached Port Harlow, the sun had dipped behind the cliffs. The lighthouse flickered once, twice, and the water caught its light in broken ripples. Helen sat in the passenger seat, quiet, her hands folded over her briefcase. Margot drove, occasionally glancing her way, waiting for her to say something. "You should have seen your face," Margot said finally, half smiling. "When the judge quoted you, it was poetic." Helen didn't respond. She was staring at the horizon, her expression calm but far from peace. "Poetry doesn't fix anything," she said softly. "It just makes people think pain has rhythm." Margot gave a small nod. "So what now?" Helen took a breath, slow and measured. "Now I do what I always do after a case. File it, close it, and move on." When they pulled up to the house, Helen climbed out first. The air smelled of seaweed and wood smoke, the faint murmur of gulls overhead. She walked up the porch steps and unlocked the door. Inside, everything looked exactly as it had before the trial. Neat, ordered, lifelessly familiar. Margot followed her in and set the briefcase on the counter. "You know, most people would be celebrating right now. You just made history." Helen poured herself a glass of water instead of wine. "History's overrated. It's just a graveyard for other people's mistakes." Margot leaned against the counter, studying her friend. "She'll be charged, you know. Fraud, conspiracy, maybe perjury. That's not something people bounce back from." Helen looked up, eyes sharp but tired. "You think I don't know that?" Margot hesitated. "Then how do you feel about it?" Helen took a sip of water, swallowed and set the glass down with care. "Empty," she said simply. "It's strange. I spent my whole life chasing justice, and when I finally got it for myself, it feels like I've lost more than I gained." Margot exhaled, crossing her arms. "That's because you're human, Helen, not a headline." Helen gave a half-smile. "Don't tell the papers that. They'd be disappointed." She walked to the window. Outside, the tide was low and the sand glistened under the moonlight. "You know what's funny?" she said quietly. "When Elise was a kid, she used to sit right there, pretending to read my legal files. Said she wanted to grow up to make the bad guys cry." Margot joined her at the window. "Looks like she achieved it. Just on the wrong end of the equation." Helen's mouth curved in something between a smile and a sigh. "She learned too well. I spent her whole life teaching her how to win. I never thought to teach her what to lose. They stood there for a long time, saying nothing. The only sound was the low groan of the waves against the rocks. When Margot finally spoke, her voice was soft. "You still love her?" Helen didn't answer immediately. She touched the glass, her reflection faint beside the night sky. "I do. But love doesn't mean blindness. It means you see them exactly as they are, and you stand anyway." Margot placed a hand on her shoulder. "You know, you could leave it there. Let the courts handle it. Let her deal with the consequences." Helen turned from the window. "That's what I'm doing. Justice isn't revenge. It's restraint." Margot smiled faintly. "Only you could make morality sound like a legal clause." Helen chuckled. A rare sound, low and dry. "Old habits." She walked to her desk and opened her notebook. On a clean page, she wrote a single line in pen. "Victory is quiet when it costs what you love." Then she closed it again and said, "I need something to do with all this anger that's pretending to be peace." Margot raised an eyebrow. "A new case?" "Not quite," Helen said. "A foundation?" Margot tilted her head. "For what? For people like me," Helen replied. "Elderly victims of financial abuse. People who can't fight back. People whose own families try to rewrite their lives with paperwork." Margot's eyes softened. "You're serious?" "Deadly," Helen said. "If my daughter thought I was incompetent, I might as well use my supposed senility to do something intelligent." Margot laughed. "That's the Helen I know, turning betrayal into a business plan." Helen shrugged. "Call it penance. Maybe if I help a few others, I'll stop wondering where I went wrong." They spent the next few hours sketching out ideas, funding, partnerships, outreach. Helen's focus returned like muscle memory. She spoke with clarity, each idea sharper than the last. It wasn't about redemption, not yet. It was about motion, the kind that kept her from collapsing into reflection. By midnight, the first page of notes was full. Margot leaned back, stretching her neck. "You really don't sleep, do you?" Helen smiled faintly. "Sleep's for people who aren't haunted by spreadsheets." Margot stood. "I'll call the county office tomorrow, see what it takes to register. You need me to stay?" "No," Helen said gently. "Go home. You've done enough for one lifetime." Margot hesitated at the door. "You sure?" Helen nodded. "I'll be fine. I just need some silence to remember what peace sounds like." When Margot left, Helen turned off all the lights except for the one over the kitchen table. The briefcase sat open, its papers still inside. She reached in and pulled out the court transcript. Her name was printed at the top. Respondent, Helen Ward. She stared at it for a moment, then folded it neatly and placed it back inside. She wouldn't throw it away. Some records are better kept, even when they ache to read. Outside, the wind picked up. The tide had started to rise again, scraping softly against the rocks. Helen stepped out onto the porch, pulling her sweater tight around her shoulders. The night smelled of brine and pinewood smoke. The lighthouse beam swept across the horizon, slow and constant. For the first time in months, Helen let herself breathe fully. It wasn't triumph she felt. It wasn't relief. It was the still, sober understanding that justice, when it finally comes, doesn't heal. It balances. And balance, she thought, is a colder kind of mercy. A week after the verdict, Helen found herself sitting at the same kitchen table where it had all started. The petition, the evidence, the betrayal. But this time, instead of court documents, the table was covered with folders stamped non-profit registration, tax ID and legal aid partnership proposal. The Harbour Light Legal Aid Foundation wasn't just an idea anymore, it was taking shape, one carefully signed document at a time. The name had come to her while she watched the lighthouse beam sweep across the bay one night. Steady, quiet, dependable. It wasn't about shining brighter than others, it was about making sure people lost in the dark could find a way home. Margot was on the phone with the county clerk, juggling 3 deadlines and a muffin. "Yes, we've filed the 501c3. No, it's not a charity for cats, it's for people. Real ones, elder abuse, financial manipulation, guardianship fraud. Yes, those are words. You can write them down." Helen smirked as she flipped through a budget spreadsheet. "You know, Margot, if sarcasm were tax deductible, we'd already be funded." Margot covered the phone's receiver. "And if patience were currency, you'd still be broke." Helen chuckled, making a note in the margin. The tension that had lived in her chest for months was finally loosening. The anger hadn't vanished. It had just found a better use. A soft knock came at the door. Helen looked up. A young woman stood outside, rain dripping from her hair, clutching a manila envelope. "Mrs. Ward?" she asked hesitantly. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name's Naomi. The clerk told me you help people with family cases." Helen motioned her in. "Come inside before you drown, Naomi. Sit. Tell me what's wrong." The girl sat, clutching the envelope like it contained her last hope. "It's my dad," she said. "My brother's trying to get power of attorney. Says my dad's losing memory, but he's fine. He just forgets where he puts his glasses sometimes. I don't know what to do." Helen listened carefully, her expression never changing. "How old is your father?" 73. "Does he have a doctor's note claiming incompetence?" Naomi shook her head. "Not yet, but my brother's talking to some doctor I've never heard of." Helen and Margot exchanged a look, the kind of glance that carried both recognition and fatigue. Helen said softly, "Let me guess, your brother handles the money?" Naomi nodded. Helen opened a drawer and pulled out a form. "Write down his name, the doctor's name if you can find it, and the date he started the process. I'll tell you exactly what to file and who to call." Naomi's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. I didn't know where else to go. The lawyers I called wanted thousands just to talk." Helen smiled gently. "Justice shouldn't come with an invoice. You're safe here." Margot slid a cup of tea across the table. "You're going to be fine, honey. Trust me, this woman could terrify a Supreme Court clerk before breakfast." Naomi laughed weakly, and the tension in the room broke a little. Helen watched her, remembering the first time she'd walked into a courtroom alone decades ago, terrified, outmatched but determined. It wasn't the law that gave people courage. It was the belief that someone would stand beside them when they had no one else. After Naomi left, Helen sat in silence for a long moment. The sound of rain against the windows blended with the ticking clock. "She reminded me of myself," she said quietly. "All that fear, all that determination wrapped into one." Margot leaned back. "Then I'd say the foundation's already doing its job." Helen nodded. "Not yet, but it will." The phone rang again, this time from the town hall. Margot answered, then handed the receiver to Helen. "It's Councilman Avery. Wants to talk about funding support." Helen took the call. "Avery, yes, we're officially registered. No, I'm not running for office, so stop panicking. If the city wants to partner with us for senior protection, I'll take the meeting. Tomorrow? Fine. Bring your budget people and your honesty in that order." She hung up and looked at Margot. "We'll need a logo, a mission statement, a board, and someone who can talk to the press without threatening to bite them." Margot pointed her. "Rules me out." Helen laughed quietly. "It rules me out too." As the day went on, the house buzzed with activity. The printer spat out draft forms, phones rang, papers piled up. Helen's once silent home was alive again, not with chaos, but with purpose. In the evening, when the work finally paused, Helen stepped outside with her tea. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled of salt and damp earth. She looked toward the harbour, where the lighthouse blinked steadily in the dark. Margot joined her, 2 mugs in hand. "You realise this whole thing started because your daughter tried to control your money?" Helen nodded slowly. "And now her greed is funding a foundation that protects people from exactly that." Margot smiled. "Poetic justice." Helen took a sip, eyes fixed on the horizon. "No," she said softly. "Just justice." They stood there quietly, the night stretching out around them. Somewhere far off, the faint sound of a ship horn echoed over the bay. Helen felt the air against her skin, cool, alive, honest. She didn't think about courtrooms or verdicts anymore. She thought about letters she'd write, people she'd help, voices she'd amplify. The silence that once protected her was now serving others. Inside, the phone rang again. Helen didn't move right away. She just smiled faintly, knowing that this time the sound wasn't a summons, it was a beginning. The air in Port Harlow had turned crisp with early autumn. Mornings came colder, water darker, and the gulls louder. Helen had just finished reviewing the first grant application for the Harbour Light Legal Aid Foundation when she heard a knock on the office door. She didn't look up right away. Most knocks came from reporters or locals seeking advice. "Come in," she said, signing the last page of a document. The door opened quietly. When Helen finally looked up, the pen froze in her hand. Elise stood there. Her daughter's once polished hair was tied back messily, her face pale but softer than Helen remembered. Gone were the designer clothes and expensive posture. Elise looked smaller, stripped of armour. She held a plain tote bag and an envelope that had been folded too many times. "Hi, Mom." Helen didn't answer at first. The room felt heavier, like air that hadn't been opened in months. "How did you know where to find me?" "I saw the article in the Gazette," Elise said, her voice low. "About the foundation. I thought maybe—" She hesitated, clutching the envelope tighter. "I thought maybe you'd let me help." Helen leaned back in her chair, studying her. "Help?" she repeated. "Interesting word choice." "I know what I did," Elise said, her eyes glistening. "I know there's no excuse for it, but I also know what it's like to be on the other side of justice now, and I want to do something that isn't just about cleaning up my name." Helen didn't reply immediately. She looked at her daughter, really looked. The same face she'd once kissed goodnight, the same hands that had signed her betrayal. Time had aged them both, but regret had carved deeper lines in Elise's than age ever could. "What's in the envelope?" Helen asked finally. Elise stepped forward and placed it on the desk. "Letters," she said softly, "from the people I've been working with during my community service, victims of financial abuse. I've been volunteering at the City Legal Aid Centre. I thought you might want to read them." Helen stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. "Volunteering was court-ordered," she said, her tone dry. "At first, yes," Elise admitted, "but I kept going after my hours ended. I didn't want to stop." Helen let that hang in the air. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, the only sound between them. "Why now?" Helen asked. Elise hesitated. "Because I don't know who I am anymore. And I figured if anyone could teach me how to start over, it'd be you." The words sat there, awkward and unpolished, but sincere. Helen exhaled slowly, then stood up and walked to the window. Outside, volunteers were unloading boxes of brochures, laughing as the wind tried to steal them. The Harbour Light sign gleamed faintly in the sunlight, a beacon she'd built from betrayal. "You realise," Helen said after a long pause, "that walking in here doesn't erase what happened." "I'm not asking it to," Elise said quickly. "I just want to make something right, even if it takes the rest of my life." Helen turned, crossing her arms. "You were always good with words. You learned that from me." Elise managed a faint, broken smile, "and I learned how to weaponize them from Dad." Helen's face didn't change, but something in her eyes softened. "Your father had his flaws. So do we." Elise swallowed hard. "I miss him. Every day." "So do I." They stood there, two people who shared blood, history, and the same quiet ache of guilt. Margot appeared in the doorway, holding a stack of files. "Oh," she said, freezing when she saw Elise. "Didn't realise we were hosting family therapy hour." Elise turned toward her. "Hi, Miss Lane." Margot raised an eyebrow. "Still Miss Lane, huh? Not the woman who found the recording that destroyed my marriage?" Elise winced. "I deserved that." Margot crossed her arms. "You deserved worse. But you're here, so maybe you're trying." Helen gave her a look and Margot sighed, dropping the files on the table. "Fine, I'll be nice. If you're volunteering, you can start with the intake forms. There's a stack taller than a preacher's sermon." Elise nodded gratefully. "Thank you." Margot left, muttering something about miracles before lunchtime. Helen returned to her desk, still standing. "You'll be working under supervision. You'll handle filing, intake, and call follow-ups. No access to client funds or case management." Elise nodded again. "That's fair." "And don't call me Mom while you're here," Helen added. "It's Mrs. Ward." Elise's lips trembled slightly, but she didn't argue. "Yes, Mrs. Ward." They began working in silence. Elise sat at the smaller desk by the window, sorting forms with slow, careful precision. Every so often, Helen glanced up, not to check her work, but to confirm she was still there. By afternoon, the office buzzed with soft noise, phones ringing, printers whirring, conversation from passing volunteers. Elise kept her head down, asking questions only when necessary. Her tone was respectful, her focus relentless. At one point, a frail woman arrived seeking help for a fraudulent guardianship case. Helen guided her through the process while Elise listened from her corner, taking notes silently. When the woman left, tears of relief in her eyes, Elise looked up. "She reminded me of you," she said quietly. "The way she tried to stay strong while the people closest to her were stealing from her." Helen didn't reply. She was reviewing documents, her pen tapping softly against the desk. Elise continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I used to think justice was about winning. Now I think it's about surviving the truth. Helen looked up at her then. Really looked. You might finally be learning something worth keeping, she said. Elise smiled faintly. Then I'll stay until I do. Helen returned to her paperwork without a word, but there was a flicker, small, reluctant, but real, in her expression. As the sun dipped behind the harbour, casting the office in gold, Helen turned off her lamp. Elise was still at her desk typing quietly, the last person left besides her. Lock up when you're done, Helen said, gathering her things. Yes, Mrs. Ward. Helen stopped at the door, her hand on the knob. And Elise? Elise looked up quickly. Yes? Helen's tone softened. Good work today. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The morning sun poured through the foundation's windows, touching the edges of case files stacked in uneven towers. Helen adjusted her reading glasses and looked over another intake form. Most days had begun this way since Elise joined. Quiet, focused, with the faint hum of coffee brewing in the background. But today wasn't like most days. Margot entered, holding a thin folder. Got a tough one, she said. An elderly widow named Mrs. Hayes. Her son forged her signature to sell her house. She's got nowhere to live. Helen looked up, her pen stopping mid-signature. Does she have proof? Margot opened the folder. Just this. Inside was a shaky, handwritten letter. He said it was just for refinancing. I didn't know until the moving truck came. Helen's jaw tightened. Schedule a meeting today. Margot hesitated. There's something else. The son's name is David Hayes. He used to intern for Miles Development. Helen froze, the old name hanging in the air like smoke. Margot continued carefully. He worked there 5 years ago. Guess greed runs in franchises. Helen nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. Let's help her. By noon, Mrs. Hayes arrived, small, pale, her hands trembling but her eyes fierce. Elise guided her into the chair, speaking softly, careful not to startle her. Helen introduced herself. Mrs. Hayes, you're safe here. Tell me what happened from the beginning. The woman took a shaky breath. He told me it was just papers for insurance, so the property would be protected. I trusted him. He's my son. But then the men came with the truck, said the deed was signed over. Elise sat quietly beside her, hands folded. Her face was unreadable, but her voice trembled when she spoke. You signed under pressure? Mrs. Hayes nodded. He said if I didn't, I'd end up in a nursing home. Helen's pen tapped softly against the desk. We'll file for fraud and coercion. Do you have copies of anything? Mrs. Hayes handed her a creased envelope. Inside were photocopies of the deed transfer, a doctor's letter declaring her mentally unfit, and a forged signature. Helen examined them closely. The handwriting was shaky, but the pattern was clear. Get these notarized, Helen said. Margot, call the county clerk's office. Tell them we're requesting a hold on the title until this is reviewed. Elise leaned forward. Mrs. Hayes, may I ask, do you still speak with your son? The woman's eyes clouded. He called yesterday, said I should stop fighting and accept reality. Said I'll thank him one day. Elise's lips pressed into a thin line. No, you won't, she said quietly. Helen looked up at her daughter. Their eyes met, and for a moment time folded in on itself. It was as if Helen were seeing Elise years ago, confident, sharp, sure of her power, and the echo of her past betrayal rippled faintly between them. They worked for hours, collecting evidence, contacting agencies, drafting motions. By late afternoon, the office smelled of printer ink and determination. Elise handled each form meticulously, checking every line twice. When the call came from the clerk's office confirming the injunction, Helen exhaled deeply. That's a start. Margot leaned against the doorway. You know, most people would have told her to just let it go. It's impressive we're still fighting this hard for strangers. Helen smiled faintly. They're only strangers until someone listens. As Margot left, Elise stayed behind, sorting Mrs. Hayes's papers. Helen watched her for a long moment before saying, You handled yourself well today. Elise looked up. I saw too much of myself in that case. Helen tilted her head. Meaning? She trusted the wrong person because she thought family meant safety. I used to think that too, until I made family the weapon. Helen said nothing, just listened. Elise continued, voice quieter now. When I saw Mrs. Hayes crying, all I could think was how you must have felt, sitting in that courtroom, listening to me try to destroy you. Helen's expression softened. You don't need to apologize every time you remember it. I'm not apologizing, Elise said, shaking her head. I'm learning. That's different. Helen studied her daughter for a moment longer. Then maybe you're finally doing what you were raised to do, defend the truth, not yourself. The words hung between them. Not praise, not forgiveness, but something sturdier. A bridge. The following week, the Hayes case went to hearing. Helen sat beside Mrs. Hayes while Elise presented the evidence. Every forged page, every suspicious transfer, every recorded voicemail. Elise spoke clearly, her tone calm but edged with conviction. When the judge ruled in Mrs. Hayes' favour, the old woman cried openly. Outside the courthouse, Mrs. Hayes hugged Elise and whispered, "You sound like someone who's seen the other side of betrayal." Elise smiled through tears. "You could say that." Helen watched the exchange quietly. Pride wasn't something she allowed herself often, but it flickered somewhere deep, like a pilot light reigniting. On the drive back, Elise looked out the window, the autumn leaves flashing gold and red. "Do you think people like me can ever make it right?" Helen's hands stayed steady on the wheel. Making it right isn't about erasing what happened. It's about what you do with what's left. Elise turned toward her, eyes wet. "What if I can't fix it?" "Then you keep working until you can live with it," Helen said simply. Back at the foundation, the office was quiet again. Helen sat down at a desk, pen in hand. She wrote a note on the final Hayes file before closing it. Justice restored. Trust earned, one wound at a time. Elise stood by the door, watching her mother write. "You know, you're not what I thought justice looked like." Helen smiled faintly without looking up. "Good. Maybe you'll make it look better." Outside, the lighthouse beam swept slowly across the bay, its reflection stretching across the office window. Helen looked at her daughter, the same one who had once been her adversary, and thought, for the first time in a long while, that maybe justice wasn't just about silence. It was also about teaching someone else how to speak again. The morning light in Port Harlow came through the windows of the Harbour Light Foundation like a gentle tide, spilling over the framed photos, the case files, and the small brass plate that read, "For those without a voice." Helen sat at her desk, glasses perched low, reviewing the last of the monthly reports. Across the room, Elise was guiding a law student through intake procedures, while Margot balanced a phone on her shoulder, arguing with a local journalist about donation disclosures. The place had grown into something larger than any of them had imagined. The first months were about surviving. Now it was about serving. Elder fraud, guardianship abuse, forged power of attorney cases, the kind of quiet cruelty no one ever made headlines for, that's what they handled now. And every time a case was won, every time a family was restored or a thief was held accountable, Helen would mark it in her notebook with one sentence. Justice spoke again. She paused to rest her eyes. The clock on the wall ticked, steady as her own pulse. Elise walked in carrying 2 coffees. "You skipped lunch again?" she said. Helen smiled faintly. "It's hard to eat when the numbers don't add up. We're running short on grant money." "I've been working on that," Elise said, setting one of the cups down. "I talked to a firm downtown. They're willing to sponsor the next legal aid seminar if we let them put their name on the flyers." Helen raised an eyebrow. "You mean they want to buy a piece of credibility?" "That's one way to look at it," Elise said. "Another way is, we use their check to keep the lights on." Helen took a sip of her coffee, smiling. "You always were a negotiator. Just make sure you're still negotiating for the right side this time." Elise nodded slowly. "I am." The air between them was easier now. The tension that once felt like stone had worn down into something manageable, the quiet weight of people who'd both learned too much about loss. A knock came at the door. Margot leaned in. "Mail's here, and something from the courthouse." Helen took the envelope and turned it over in her hands. The seal was from the New York County Superior Court. She slit it open carefully, scanning the contents. Then she smiled, not wide, but deeply. "What is it?" Elise asked. "It's from Judge Haynes," Helen said, her voice even. "He's retiring, says he's donating part of his pension to the foundation, calls it his interest payment on integrity." Margot chuckled. "That's poetic for a man who used to fine people for using metaphors in filings." Helen placed the letter on her desk. "It's not about money. It's a reminder that decency outlasts everything else." Elise stood there quietly for a moment before asking, "Do you ever regret it? Going to court that day? Facing me?" Helen looked up. No, because it wasn't about winning. It was about remembering who I was before fear tried to rewrite me. Elise nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "I think about that moment every day, the way you stood there and didn't yell, you just waited. And somehow that silence said more than anything." Helen smiled faintly. "That's because silence isn't the absence of power. It's what power sounds like when it stops explaining itself." Outside, the faint hum of boats from the harbour drifted through the window. The lighthouse flashed once, a soft pulse of light across the water. Elise turned toward it. "You ever think of leaving this place? Retiring for real?" Helen chuckled. "Retirement is for people who want quiet. I've had enough silence to last a lifetime." Margot looked up from her desk. "Then what's next, boss?" Helen took off her glasses, folded them neatly and leaned back. "Next, we keep doing what we're doing until justice doesn't need our help to speak." That afternoon, the foundation hosted a small community workshop. A dozen locals came, seniors, caregivers, a few young lawyers. Helen stood at the front, explaining guardianship rights and the warning signs of financial manipulation. Elise helped distribute pamphlets while Margot handled the slideshow. At one point, a man in the back raised his hand. "Mrs. Ward, after all you've seen, do you really believe justice still works?" Helen paused. The room went quiet. Then she said simply, "Justice isn't something that works. It's something you work for, every day, in small, unglamorous ways. It doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it just looks like surviving with your conscience intact." When the session ended, the audience applauded softly. Elise caught her mother's eye, and for the first time, Helen saw pride in her daughter's expression, not in herself, but in the work. That night, after everyone left, Helen stayed behind. The foundation was quiet again, the only light coming from her desk lamp. She opened her notebook, the one she'd carried since the trial, and turned to a blank page. In slow, deliberate handwriting, she wrote, "If you are reading this, it means I've gone. Not forever, just for a long rest. Justice doesn't retire. It only changes hands." She signed her name and slipped the letter into an envelope addressed both to the staff of Harbourlight. Then she picked up the small silver USB drive she'd kept in her desk, the one that had started it all. She looked at it for a long time, the way one looks at an old scar, then stood and walked outside. The night air was cool, the sea restless but calm. Helen walked down the dock until the water lapped just below her shoes. The lighthouse beam cut across the bay in a slow, deliberate sweep. She held the USB for a moment, then let it fall into the water. The splash was quiet, swallowed instantly by the tide. "Every piece of evidence has an expiration," she murmured. "Only the lesson remains." Behind her, the lights of the foundation glowed softly through the windows. She turned back, watching them flicker against the glass, steady, alive. The next morning, Margot found the letter on Helen's desk beside her old gavel. Elise stood beside her, silent. She opened the note and read aloud the closing line. "Justice spoke my name once. Now it's your turn to let it speak yours." Elise wiped her eyes, folded the letter carefully, and pinned it to the notice board above the foundation's motto. The morning light caught the brass letters just as the lighthouse beam swept across the harbour. One flash, one pause, one return, like the quiet rhythm of a promise still kept. The story of Helen Ward isn't just about justice. It's about survival in silence, the kind that only comes from being betrayed by the people you raised. Her fight wasn't against strangers, but against blood. And in the end, she didn't take revenge in the way people expect. She didn't shout, didn't destroy, didn't even try to win. She simply stood, waited, and let the truth speak for itself. Because in the real world, family revenge stories aren't about vengeance. They're about dignity. They're about mothers, fathers, and children learning that the sharpest justice isn't loud or violent. It's the kind that arrives quietly, long after the courtroom closes, when the people who tried to break you finally face what they've become. And if you've ever lived through your own family drama, if you've ever been blamed, betrayed, or made to feel invisible, remember this. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not what you do, but what you don't do. Silence, integrity, and peace can be the most powerful responses of all. If stories like Helen's move you, Stories where betrayal meets justice and family ties turn into the battleground of truth. Then you're in the right place. Subscribe now for more family revenge stories and dramas that remind us all. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands tall and lets the world notice. Because every silence hides a story, and every story deserves to be heard.